And we're talking today, very loudly, about the fusion between mixing and sound design, which is kind of interesting because in our talks over the past couple of days, we've seen that there's not a lot of sharing between the design. There's collaboration, but there's not like, okay, you mix for a while, I'm going to go and cut, you're going to cut, I'm going to mix. So what we're going to talk about today is just some of the changes in a design point that David has gone through from just delivering the tracks to the stage, and then maybe to how you're bringing your work to future pictures that you're on. So why don't you start with your process of how you get to the stage?
Well, first of all, does everybody know the difference in our two jobs? I mean, editing versus mixing. I mean, I don't want to dumb it down too much. I mean, but you know, basically, I'm the guy that used a good analogy a little while ago. Was that I was in a cooking environment. I'm the guy that puts together the ingredients, and he's the one that makes the final product. So he's the one that has to sit at the console and blend all these things into a final product. But I'm one of the people that has to create things from scratch, build them to picture, and deliver elements that then have to get finessed together later.
You lay the egg, I make the omelet.
Yeah, okay. So that's sort of the basics of it. So I didn't want anybody to just hear this whole thing and not really realize that there is a difference in jobs. There's a humongous different entities, you know, even in editing. You know, I'm a sound designer and sound effects, but there's people that do dialogue, nothing but dialogue. They sit around all day and do dialogue, and that includes production dialogue and ADR, which is replaced dialogue. It's recorded later that then has to get put in sync back in, you know, make it live or be in sync with what was the production, and then Mark has to make that match, you know. So anyway, there's a whole group of people that have to prepare this stuff behind the scenes before it ever hits the mix stage. And the mix stage, another term that I didn't know for a while when I started working, was that's where you sit in front of the console with the screen up. That we call it a mix stage. Mm-hmm. So I'm just trying to get a couple of these terms out here we may be flippantly throwing out there that people may not know what they are. So, you know, my process, you know, we could be here all day. This could be, you might not get a chance to talk today, Mark, sorry. No, I'm kidding. You know, and it depends project to project. You know, we're going to talk about the films first, I guess, because the games are a smaller process. But we'll get a copy of the film, you know, and it depends on the director or the project. Sometimes we'll get a copy of the script early, sometimes not. You know, it just depends. You can start thinking about the film early when you do get a script, but a lot of times it's really, your inspiration really comes from what you see. So, you know, I don't know how to really get into it too much, but you'll see the thing, and that's where you get your inspiration. Like you sort of have to hear it in your head. It's like watching the movie down. One of the tricks I used to always use was to watch a movie that was already existed, but turn the sound off and try to imagine what this would sound like. And so you have to start to be able to hear that thing that's going on inside your head. Like you see this image, and what do you hear that should be attached to that? Because then you have to be able to create a sound that matches something, but you have to sort of figure out what that something is before you even start. So you can see an explosion and you say, okay, explosion, but you have to, more than that, you have to see, okay, this explosion has a fireball that goes this way and it lights up the screen in this way, and it's got a little bit of metal in it, or some glass goes flying off this way. So you have to be able to hear all these elements in your head before you ever start to try to sculpt it. Because you really are sort of, it's like painting. You're adding elements as you go, and you'll start with the basic sound, say a real explosion, then you'll add other things. Anything could be from blowing on a microphone to one of the things that, in my opinion, one of the things that makes, say, an explosion really interesting is not the boom, not the pop, not the crack of it, but all the things that go on after it, the debris that falls. You know, I remember we were working on a film, Island to Dr. Moreau, and this was one of the Harry's things, but it was a big dock that blew up out in the water. And Harry had built this whole amazing explosion with fireballs and all this stuff. And the supervisor came in and said, well, do you have some good wood landing on water? Because this pier blew up, and all these pieces of wood were flying in the air and falling, but we had nothing for when it actually hit the water. And, and it's those little sort of details, really bring what you see on screen to life. Like as soon as you added a few splashes, a few pieces of planks hitting the water, the whole thing just popped to life a lot better. It's a long process, really, getting things to the mix stage. You have to figure out, and people don't, when you're mixing records, you're mixing a song. It's like a 3 to 4 minute song usually, and it's usually a top to bottom sort of thing. You automate it and you print it and you're done. But in films, these things are split out into different, we call them premixes. I think on Rings we called them A through N. Each one, you go through letters and say A will be one set of type of effects. Say, I don't know, in that case it wasn't explosions, but it was, say, hard effects, big impacts, rock hits, things like that. B would be, swords. C would be whooshes and swishes. D would be horses. E would be, say, creature roars. F would be another type of creature or something like that. E could be, say, orcs. The other one could be cave troll. And it just goes on and on. All these different things that you want to have control of later have to be split out into different, they have to be able to show up on different parts of the console so that if the director goes, we lower the orcs there. You got to be able to find E and, pull them down, but leave the rest of it untouched. And it's the thing that about films and mixing and preparing tracks that I think goes unknown until somebody hits the working world, is that these things are so wide. Because, say, they get mixed down to a 5-1 or 7-1 or whatever it is. That one, say, A premix could be built from 60 tracks to start with. So if you start thinking about that A through N sound effects, and each one has 30 or 40 tracks building it, you've got a lot of things being built to sort of, and it just funnels down and keeps getting smaller and smaller until in the end you've got a 5-1 or 7-1 composite mix of dialogue, music, and effects. But all the way through the process, even at the end, you got your effects are still, there is what's called an effect stem, a dialogue stem, a music stem. These things are all printed separately again, because to their own individual elements, because you have to be able to go in there later and put different versions. You have to be able to put the Spanish version or the German versions. You have to be able to replace all the dialogue, but leave everything else as it was. The effects and the music, they all have to be there. Foley is another thing that gets recorded, that, footsteps and cloth movement and all these things, as soon as you replace the dialogue in a different language, all of that has to be there. And to be honest, one of my favorite things to listen to is the M&E, which is called the music and effects pass of the film, because you watch the whole thing down and everything is there. Every little footstep, every little thing you hear, but the dialogue, they'll be talking and there'll be nothing, because that just leaves a hole for the other languages that are going to be put in.
So how much, as a designer, how much do you mix or consider yourself mixing these pre-mixes now than you did, let's say, 5-10 years ago?
A lot more. I mean, back when we started at EFX, we had way fewer tracks because we were printing to 3324s and 3348s. We had very few tracks to deliver to the stage, so we would have backgrounds, maybe only 24 tracks. And that's nowhere near the case now. There's so many, with Pro Tools, you have so many more tracks you can go to. And then we had a little bit of a different approach, because we sort of had to. We would sort of premix in the synclav. We would combine sounds that then would get printed to, say, a stereo track or something like that. And where everybody else was working on MAG, they were delivering separate elements. It's almost sort of gone back to being wider now, like it was on MAG, but with increased capabilities. For the temp mixes, which have become more and more demanding, the temp mix means a version of the film that has a complete soundtrack built to it way before the release, to an early cut of the film. They used to not be so stringent about how good that sounded. It was just like, okay, give us some better stuff than we have in our picture department. Now they expect the whole thing to be done. They expect a lot of work to be done, design work, expect it all early. And in the course of the way the pictures are built and edited now, they change the picture so much all along that it's great to have a good temp mix early, so that you can, because you have to play keep up. You keep trying to keep your tracks in sync with the way the picture's changing, and in so doing that, we do a lot nowadays cutting in 5.1 premixes, or at least sending the files, routing the audio out of, say, a 5.1 aux. Mm-hmm. Say the A premix, I'll be cutting these things and all the tracks will go out of a 5.1 aux output. Then can hit the console as a 5.1. And if I've got the proper environment to edit in, the 5.1 room, I can pre-pan things around. So the mixer, when they're doing their fast and dirty temp mix, they don't have to grab this element and move it across the room. It's already sort of comes up on their console that way. And, you know, sometimes these things are printed down to a 5.1 audio file. You know, each premix might get printed down. It just depends on what the capabilities of the Pro Tools on the mix stage is. But a lot of times we keep those elements live and feed them through an aux that then hits the console. So that if the mixer doesn't like a certain element or something's not working, we can always go in and mute that. So it's not part of an embedded audio file already.
Now, would that be you going in and muting or moving that sound?
Yeah,
or
me or you know whoever's manning the Pro Tools on that mix. Okay. You know.
Now, so you, because of the changes in Pro Tools, do you have a 5.1 setup at home?
Yes.
So you're able to largely create and send the premixes almost across the web.
Yeah.
And have it land on the stage and make changes at home, update the Pro Tools file if you had to.
Could, but you know, as far as like if the mix is going on and I'm trying to support it from home,
you'd want to be there.
Yeah, them sending me a Pro Tools file and then me trying to go mute a file and then send it back to them. It doesn't sort of work that way, because then they have to close the session down and all that, and and if they haven't sent me an updated version, and, you know, as it gets something gets crossed, then that usually doesn't. I usually don't support a mix in that way, you know, muting something. But they may call me and say, we need a different screech or something at this point. I can do a fix, and then send them a small set of tracks that then they can import into that session, and then they have the new sound effect there then.
Now, you know, moving to you, Mark, you do all of your work on a stage. You're always behind a console. We were talking earlier this week about Pro Tools 10. You're on a euphonics desk. Pro Tools 10 is bringing a lot of euphonics-friendly elements into the Pro Tools work surface. Do you envision anywhere in the future of you being able to pre-mix a passive dialogue at home or work on a project more remotely before going to the stage to finish?
You know, the one thing that stops me from doing that is the acoustic environment I need to be in. I mean, I need to make sure that it's going to translate to the stage, and that's kind of the biggest hindrance of doing it. You can build a small room. You don't need as big of a room, and obviously I could sit there on my Pro Tools and do it at home or wherever I wanted to. But I think that's the real expensive part of being able to do it, is making sure that it's going to translate. And dialogue's a little harder, because with dialogue, I want the dialogue to have a certain sound, and you try and make it all smooth and full and all this. And so if you get the whole thing wrong, you've gotten the whole movie wrong. So you have to be really careful. So I don't know if that'll happen that much. What we're seeing happen is a couple things. We're seeing a lot more shows. I pre-dub a lot more shows now where I don't print any pre-dubs. I just have the automation running live at the end of during the final. I still have everything, so I haven't married anything together. And I automate all my reverbs and do all that stuff. And then the other thing that is happening a lot more is there are also people that are actually mixing on the stage with using the Yukon and actually mixing when I'm talking about, pre-dubbing virtually, I'm using console automation that I play back. But there are other people that are actually mixing in Pro Tools using the Yukon layer and actually writing the automation into Pro Tools and using all plugins in Pro Tools and just using the desk pretty much as a monitoring, station. And that's where we're seeing things go more and more. In Pro Tools 10, one of the big things that happened in Pro Tools 10 is Yukon is this protocol that Avid has made that lets a different piece of hardware talk to Pro Tools and control directly. And at this point, it's been really limited. It was almost like a HUI functionality up to this point. Now we can when I'm looking at the euphonics, I can literally grab the EQ knob, and it's the EQ in the Pro Tools, and I can grab a panner and do it on the console, and it's seamless to go back and forth. So I think that's the biggest trend we'll see in the next 3 or 4 years.
Mm-hmm. Now, so if he's worrying about translation, how are you solving that problem, translating from your home to the stage?
Well, translation is a big problem. I would say it's even a problem between editing rooms. Finding a standard for any sort of environment to me is still the most frustrating thing. No matter what room I work in, particularly the sub, the low end information is always off in some way. It always feels wrong. I did a show last year at a major facility. We were doing the mix, and I'm not going to name it, but they had put me in in one of their design rooms during the mix to sort of go offline and do things, and it was impossible because the room sounded terrible. And this was a major facility that they were used to having, I think, picture people working there that weren't really I guess finessed enough in paying attention to what they were listening to, and they just didn't care maybe. But it was really hard. I actually had to start working on headphones in that room because I knew what my headphones sound like, and I know how things translate that way. And it's really funny because some of the work I would consider to be some of my best work, I've actually done on headphones. These Sennheiser, not even expensive ones. I think they're the HD 265 or something. They're not really super expensive. But those things, if I build it on there and it sounds good on those headphones, I've never taken it to the mix and been surprised by what I heard. It was really strange. But I have had problems with some other rooms that were really expensively put together, some really expensive speaker systems that weren't flat. I mean, they say they're flat, but the sound was hyped, and things I would build would sound great in those rooms. Take them to the mix stage, and they just completely fall apart. So in some ways, I've used lots of monitors at home, lots of different systems, and I still to this day keep mixing them up and changing speakers around. I've had my best luck with using some speakers that were actually underpowered or not the flattest, that made me work a little harder. Because some of these other speakers like the Mackie HR824s and things, they sound phenomenal. But to me, I stopped working on the sound before I should, because it sounds good in my room before it would sound good on the mix stage. Mm-hmm. Those are some of the instances where I've been the most surprised with how sound changes, like working on those Mackies. So I got rid of my Mackies a while ago. But yeah, translation is a real problem. I mean, when you get used, I've found that when I get work in a room for a little while, I get used to what I'm hearing, and what I normally do in a new room when I go to a new spot to work is play a movie that I know really well and respect the mix that has been done. Like one of my favorite movies, still sound effects wise, one of my favorite scenes is the T-Rex attack in Jurassic Park. So I usually play that over the system I'm working in, and I get used to what that scene sounds like over those speakers. I play it back 4 or 5 times. And then it's a really strange thing how your ear starts to acclimate to the curve of the room, and you get used to building things. You play your own sound effects, that you're used to using over and over and over again, and your brain and your ears sort of acclimate to what that room now sounds like. When I did the Incredible Hulk, I was doing the vocals on that. And I was working in our god-awful room that was off the picture editorial, just concrete walls, a tiny little space, some Genelec 1031s or 1030s, I forget what the bigger ones are. But they were super bright, and it was a horrible, horrible spot to be trying to create sounds in. But my ear somehow compensated for a bit of it, and when we got to the stage, everything sounded okay.
Now, if I know that time on the mix stage is very, very critical and very expensive, but given the opportunity, I mean, would you like to at least have one final pass before anybody got to hear it, if you could go into the stage and listen to it.
If I could play it back on the stage once and listen to it? Yeah. And fortunately, in a way, that sort of does happen as we particularly if we have a lot of temp mixes, we get to hear it. We get to hear it on the stage. So you get to hear how your stuff is working in a bigger room, in a real mixing environment. So, but yeah, I would say yes. I would. That would be advantageous.
And with David, you talk about, we say it's a big problem, and it almost sounds like it's impossible to overcome. I mean, we have mixed stages that are right next to each other, are built exactly the same time, have the exact same equipment, and they sound different. I mean, it's a weird. There's something in the air molecule or something very, very weird. But the way you overcome it is you get familiar reference material that you can take different places. You really have to hone in your critical listening skills, and you have to, I can almost always, part of my job is I can walk in if we take a movie out to a movie theater to show it, and I go, oh, this is where the problem is. I know that the room's too bright or it's too low or the something's wrong. And subs are impossible to match anywhere because physically it's very hard to do. But once you know that, you become good at adjusting at things. And David might go, I got to work in this crappy room. Well, you just can't build the room all of a sudden. So you can find your reference, and then okay, this room's really bright, so I got to be very careful that I don't dull things up too much just because it's bright. And the other point about that is and one of the reasons, but for me, one of the reasons it doesn't work as well doing my dialogue is because I have to then. It works fine for us because we know what that is, but for me to translate that to somebody else is very hard, and so that's why I have to have a kind of. If I have a client or a director, I can't say, oh, trust me, it'll be fine on the mixed stage. Right. So it's a little different on the editorial side where we can kind of trust, maybe not an ideal situation, but for us, we have to be able to sell our client. And I'd say almost 50% of the shows I have to deal with, we take the movies out and show them different places. And there's always a bit of a hand holding and calming people down. It's going to be okay. And, we'll get it to sound right. But it's physics are hard to twist to where you need them to be.
Now, in that vein, what are you doing on the deliverable side so that the viewers get a sense of what you intended during the mix? I mean, because we're seeing more films streaming, more films on mobile devices, on earbuds. I mean, is that a thought while you're doing the mix of? Are we getting kind of in the same realm as the music industry where you want to hear it in the room, you want to hear it on smaller speakers, you want to hear it in the car, you want to hear it, so that what you're creating is going to be at least perceived by the audience as best it can in different scenarios? No.
Well, I have a very old-fashioned attitude about it, and I'm pretty active in the home theater communities too, and this is a big. People complain about, they find out that we've remastered for home theater and stuff, and then why spend $50,000 in my year and I should have what you have? And, it's hard to explain to somebody that a 4,000 square foot dub stage is never going to be recreated in the home. It's just, there's things you can't do. But I'm a little old fashioned about it. It's like, we do something to a set reference, we do it, the filmmaker signed off on it. It's what we do. And if we make it the best we can make it there and we have it's translatable to a movie theater that's, the Dolby CP is set to 7 and the room's tuned to 85 and it's on the X curve, it should translate. I do have a healthy respect for the need. The only venue I worry about is then home video and home, I can't worry about what's going to sound like an iPod, because if you decide that you want to watch a movie on an iPod, the experience of watching it on the little screen there's so many other things wrong with how that's going to make the sound translate psychologically and stuff that I don't think you can guard against that. I don't think there's any way to guard against that, but we're a little concerned about how it comes into the home, and my overriding feeling about getting things repurposing or remastering for home is I kind of do the least amount of things. I mean, I think in Superbad I made 3 or 4 little changes, and most of the time it's just. My real feeling is I just turn things up that are just a little low, because most people don't listen at the 85 reference, so they tend to listen between 80 or 75 down, maybe 5 or 10 dB. And what ends up happening is things fall, so if somebody's whispering something, you have to be careful about that stuff. But I let the big stuff get as big as I want, and I just try and make it so we compress the dynamic range just a little bit. I get so hammered about this sometimes on these theater forums and stuff, and it's like, guys, I'm talking about 1 or 2 dB that I might raise the dialogue stem or raise the backgrounds because the air drops off the floor. But that's really the only thing you can do. And then even then, I can't guarantee, that people are going to play it back properly in their home. And people always, they go, well, yeah, I said it. And I just like the sub loud, so they turn the sub up 6 dB. And we'd all be mortified, but that's what people, you can't. People, there's this whole conversation between reference versus preference, and people are going to do what they want to do. But we just try and, what we hear on the mix stage is what we have all desired for it to be, and so that's always our main thing.
Yeah, I've never had any clients, even in gaming, where we're prepping say a sequence that's going to be mixed in 5.1. Well, we'll mix it in 5.1, and it'll only ever play in stereo anywhere, usually. And one of the clients I had recently would just, say, well, should we be careful with this? Because this is 5.1. It's not going to ever play like that. And he was like, no, screw it. We're going to play this in case it ever plays in 5.1. I want it to be the best. Mm-hmm. I want it to be at what it might be. The only time I've ever heard in films that I ever heard a director say something about the DVD or something like that was only, okay, this is going to get chopped out of the movie for now, but we better set it aside because we're going to put it back in the extended version. It was more like saving the scene, like don't throw away your work here because it's going to come out, but it's going to go back. Mm-hmm. It wasn't ever like a spec of, well, let's make sure the compression is going to be a certain level, so we have to watch the quality of it.
Well, here's another good example. I know staff and students in the past have talked about creating their 5.1 mix in the different labs here across campus, and they're going to author their DVD. They author it in Dolby Digital. There's a sense of trying to figure out where the dial norm is it's going to sit in with the compression settings, and you're authoring your DVD. You put that DVD in a system, and in many cases we've done it on our dub stage here at Full Sail, where you play the same DVD of a 6-track mix that you just authored. It's low. It doesn't sound anywhere near it. It seems like the dynamic range control is moving it at whim. And I've always joked about it being like you send it to a stubborn mastering engineer and say like, no, we wanted that quiet. Mm-hmm. And Dolby's like, no, it's gonna come up because we want it to. And how do you fight that? Or
I mean, usually I found, because yes, we have, there's this big, if we start talking about home theater and stuff, there's this big perception that DTS is a much better codec than Dolby, and they're both lossless, and I will just tell all you there is no difference between the two. There's a perception because it gets used more that it's better, all these other things. But so I just always say, look, we don't mix for the codec. We make a master, and we know that the master works. So usually I would say if there's a problem with that down the road, it's alleviated by following things down the path. It's usually not from the master. So. It's not that I don't worry about it, but once again, if we have something that we know is done in the proper environment at the proper place, you can't guard against that if it's going to be really overly compressed or any of those other things. You just have to make sure your master is good.